Okay, all right, so welcome to the third seminar in the series by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and Associate Professor, Dr. Corey Schultz. Dr. Schultz is an Associate Professor in my school, the Institute, the School of International Communications at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. Dr. Schultz is an honorary fellow of the Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton, and he's also a member of the Sino-Judaic Institute. His research interests include Chinese visual culture, film phenomenology, and memory studies. And today, Corey is going to be speaking on Jews and Jewishness in contemporary China, discursive constructions and considered obscurement. So Dr. Schultz will speak for around 30 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A afterwards. And you're welcome throughout to write your questions on Zoom if you so wish. Okay, Dr. Schultz, take it away.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect, great. Well, thank you very much for your very kind invitation to let me speak today. That's very, very kind of you. I'm very touched, thank you. So this presentation is based on my current research into Jewish museums and historical sites in China. And so these are the Harbin Jewish Museum, the Shanghai Jewish Refuges Museum, and most recently, the Kaifeng Jewish Quarter. So I am not a historian. Rather, my research specialty is Chinese visual culture, specifically Chinese film. And this research project is something that was actually, I came across by accident. And it grows out of another research project that I was working on, which I began in August 2016. So this was funded by the British Academy and was titled Sites and Sites of Commemoration. And it examines the ways specific Chinese episodes of trauma have been recently commemorated in state-funded Chinese museums and films, and interrogates the ways that these sites, the places, and the sites, the films, discursively, representationally, and effectively create meaning. So this grant funded my initial research trip to China, and this is a country I now call home after joining University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China in 2019. And my presentation tonight is based on the data I gathered during the research trips in 2016, as well as other follow-up trips in 2019 to 2020. So in this presentation, I begin by examining how Jews and Jewishness are discursely constructed in the Harbin and Shanghai museums, and how they reflect larger philo-Semitic discourses currently circulating in China as found in self-help literature. I then analyze the museum's narratives that praise the nation for its alleged protection of 20th century European Jewish refugees, which I connect to current political desires to tell China's stories well. This is a state effort to promote China as a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and a developer of international development. I conclude by contrasting these philo-Semitic discourses and patriotic narratives with the current movement to obscure the history of the nation's indigenous Jews in Kaifeng and query as to its larger significance. So these are the sites that I'm going to be examining today. And this is what I was mentioning about telling China's stories well. So it's 讲好中国故事. So telling China's stories well by presenting China as a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and an upholder of international development. So this was first introduced by the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, Central Committee, Xi Jinping, in August 2013, during his first meeting on propaganda, when he stated that leaders needed to, and I quote, tell China's story well and properly disseminate China's voice through presenting China as a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and an upholder of international development. And this was later emphasized at a foreign affairs meeting in November 2014, when he proclaimed the country, and I quote, must raise our country's soft power, telling China's story well. In 2017, during the opening session of the 19th CPC National Congress, Xi stated, We will improve our capacity for engaging in international communication so as to tell China's story well, present a true multidimensional and panoramic view of China, and enhance our country's cultural soft power. In this missive, state and non-state actors must work internationally to strengthen and innovate external propaganda, thereby enhancing China's international discourse power as a key aspect of its comprehensive national power. So I'd like to keep this in mind as I go to my first site. Now, the discourses that are surrounding Jews and Jewishness in China, I think a lot of us probably know about the positive, the philo-Semitic discourses. I have this quote by Zhou Xun from Chinese Perceptions of the Jews and Judaism, A History of the Youtai. And let's see. And so they write, on one hand, Jew and Jewishness symbolize a tradition. On the other hand, it can equally invoke modernity. One day the Jew is a stateless slave. Another day the Jew is the dominant power in the world. The Jew is a nationalist and at the same time a cosmopolitan. He can be a filthy capitalist or an ardent communist, a committed revolutionary or a spineless loser. In other words, anything which is not Chinese is Jewish. At the same time, anything which is Chinese is also Jewish. Anything which the Chinese aspire to is Jewish. At the same time, anything which the Chinese despise is Jewish. And this kind of helps us think about the various discourses that are surrounding Jews and Jewishness. Now, originally there was this kind of, I won't get into this too deeply, but there was I think most of us know about the philo-Semitic discourse currently around Jews and Jewishness in China, and that's what I'm going to focus on. But traditionally, it wasn't always this way. So Jewishness was associated with, say, the Opium Wars, the loss of Hong Kong, et cetera, and sometimes people who were Jewish or thought to be Jewish were blamed for some of these events. And so there are instances of anti-Semitism, but for the purposes of modern day China, it's mostly philo-Semitic, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. So here is the Harbin Jewish Museum, and this is the entry of the museum. So to briefly outline Harbin's history, in 1896, China and Russia agreed to construct a railway across Manchuria and Russia. And 2 years later, the city of Harbin was founded by Russian workers, laying what became known as the Chinese Eastern Railway. In an attempt to further Russify the area, Tsar Nicholas II encouraged Russian migration, a policy that specifically attracted Russian Jewish immigrants who were fleeing pogroms in other parts of the Russian Empire by promising them religious freedom, business rights, and education without restrictions and quotas. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, a new wave of Russian and Russian Jewish refugees fled to Harbin. By 1931, there were over 13,000 Jewish residents, compared to about 150,000 Russians and over 1 million Chinese. And the Jewish community had built 3 synagogues, a hospital, a school, a home for the elderly, and ran stores, banks, charities, and newspapers. The Russian Jewish residents also created the first symphony orchestra in China, and thus Harbin became famous for its music and culture, referred to as the St. Petersburg of the East. However, this golden age was short-lived. In 1931, the old synagogue was burnt by Russian fascists, and the Russian army invaded the city. An economic depression and the resulting chaos, mixed with an increase in anti-Semitic attacks led by Russians and Japanese, caused 8,000 Jews to leave Harbin for Shanghai and Tianjin. In 1945, the Soviet Union took control of the city, and many of the Jewish leaders were sent to gulags. After China's People's Liberation Army took control of the city in 1946, the remaining Jewish residents were divested of their businesses, and many emigrated to Israel with the assistance of the Israeli government. By 1959, the Jewish population had decreased to 153, and on November 20th, 1965, the Jewish community in Harbin ceased functioning. After this date, only a few Jewish residents remained, with the final Jewish resident passing away in 1985. So the Harbin Jewish Museum, founded in 2004, is located in the former New Jewish Synagogue, an 800-seat building completed in 1921. The museum represents the Jewish history of Harbin and its effects in the present, but there is currently no Jewish community in Harbin. Thus, the museum projects its message to domestic tourists and international tourists, some of whom may be Jewish. The museum's main exhibit emphasizes the cultural and economic capital of the Harbin Jewish community. For instance, panel titles include the Jewish contributions to the economic growth of Harbin, and another refers to them as ambassadors of Western civilization to Harbin, stating that Jews brought to China Europe's latest achievements in social sciences, literature, art, and natural science, and spread Western culture and brought advanced science and technology to Harbin and China as a whole. To support this, it references data that in the 1920s, 33.8% of Harbin's Jewish population were employed in the fields of education, law, journalism, medicine, engineering, technology, culture, and the arts, and that members of the Jewish community included exceptional individuals, famous professors, excellent journalists, talented pianists and violinists, who are well known both at home and abroad, and brought about remarkable achievements. It praises their musical accomplishments and concludes by declaring, in helping to spread the Western culture to the East, Jews made an extraordinary contribution and thus added an illustrious page to the annals of Harbin's culture. The exhibit's themes of perceived Jewish excellence in culture and economics connects to a current Chinese fascination with famous Jews and people they consider to be Jews, who are believed to have the genes and the quote-unquote genes and quote-unquote secret knowledge for success, and are lauded for being smart, rich, and good at making money, end quote. This has been referred to as Jewish fever, Yo Tai Ri, which M. Avram Ehrlich explains. The Jews are perceived to be deeply committed to the family, intelligent, and very rich. Achieving this so effectively with what appears to be such little infrastructure seems to have captivated the imagination and respect of Chinese people. Therefore, Jews may in many ways represent Chinese ultimate expectations and hopes and projection of what foreigners and themselves ought and wish to achieve. Further examples of this are also found in museums exhibits, two of which are recreations of a Jewish home and a Jewish office. In the home recreation, the items stress artistic and musical elements, as well as connect to this to child rearing. Oil paintings decorate the walls of the bedroom, and statues of children are happily playing with building blocks on the bed, with a panel explaining in Chinese, Russian, and English that such homes were simple and practical, and that the children's lives are rich and colorful. The larger sitting room is richly furnished with European sideboards, an oil painting of a violinist, a samovar, and even a grand piano, with a statue of a little boy playing it, while a statue of a woman, probably his mother, looks on. The provenance of these items is not stated on the labels, but the home is coded as a specifically Jewish space, represented by a menorah's prominent placement on the pedestal and another multilingual panel that explains that it represents a Jewish home in the first half of the 20th century, stating in English, "The Jews were very choosy about the displays of their families, who paid great attention to the social manners and children's art education, while the Chinese translation emphasizes that social etiquette and art education were taken very seriously." The next room bridges the themes of culture and child rearing with that of economics. It is also richly furnished, with a statue of a bearded man sitting at a desk, typing on a typewriter, with an oil painting of a landscape and a bronze statue of Cupid on a pedestal behind him. It is labeled, and I quote, "Real workplace of Jewish industrialist in Harbin," and states, at the first half of the 20th century, nearly 20,000 Jews lived and worked in Harbin. They brought the science of technology and the management concept into Harbin, who had made important contributions to Harbin's economic development. The economic impact of Jewish immigration is also stressed in another panel, which also reinforces their roles contributing to the city. It explains the city of Harbin has stepped into a new millennium with a completely new look, but its people will forever remember the great contribution made by the Jewish people to the development of the city. Many sites where Jews once were active in are well preserved, reminding us of the time when they freely engaged in religious, economic, and cultural activities. Furthermore, there's a section in English titled "The Jewish Contribution to the Economic Growth of Harbin," but in Chinese, it is a bit stronger, stating that they launched Harbin's economic miracle. The emphasis here is on how the Jewish community contributed to Harbin. They are not described as foreign capitalist imperialists or exploiters or agents of the aforementioned foreign domination, but rather as contributing to the city's development and its economic miracle. In this narrative, not only do the panels highlight the Jewish contribution to the city, they also stress the self-sufficiency of the Jewish community by emphasizing that they did not take anything in return. For example, the museum highlights the charitable organizations, hospitals, schools, libraries, banks, businesses, and newspapers, which one panel describes as, and I quote, "forming a fairly complete social system," thus emphasizing that the Jewish migrants were not robber barons, but only contributors. So in the exhibit, the Harbin Jews also proffered as models due to their cultural and economic successes. To examine this further, the so-called Jewish approaches to business and education are also promoted in self-help literature. This has been examined quite a bit. A quick search of books for the keyword Jew, Yotairen, revealed hundreds of titles, which mostly fall into two categories: learning Jewish ways of thinking and learning Jewish business methods, both of which connect the museum's themes. For example, some of these include Think Like a Jew, Jewish Mother Teaches Thinking, and Jewish Parenting, as well as The Wisdom of the Jews, Jewish Secrets of Success, Jewish Business Regulations, Jewish Business Sense, and Jewish Philosophy of Earning Money. Although based on anti-Semitic tropes involving wealth, these titles are overwhelmingly philo-Semitic and are part of the larger aforementioned Jewish fever operating in China. So such self-help literature connects to a long history in China of using models to inspire change in the viewer. In Chinese, these models were called mofan, which means an exemplary thing, pattern for emulation, model, standard ideal. This developed from the Confucian belief of xiushen, which means to fix the self, and was based on the idea that correct ideas of behavior could be inculcated in the populace by presenting the right model. For instance, during the Maoist period, the socialist figures of worker, peasant, and soldier, referred to as the Gongmongbing, were viewed as vehicles of socialization to develop a new society through individual emulation, therefore producing a new socialist person from the inside out. Thus, these modern socialist models were intended to produce a new socialist citizen through the inspiration they offered. During the contemporary period, however, other models are needed, and the philo-Semitic discourses that circulate in China that promote Jews for their economic and cultural success can be seen as serving these new models. This is apparent from the aforementioned titles, which focus on economic and scholastic achievement, as well as how Jews and Jewishness are discursively constructed in the museum. Additionally, this self-help literature is part of the contemporary Chinese discourse surrounding suzhi, which is quality, a popular belief that people can improve their quality and human capital through education, high culture, technology, and personal improvement. Stemming from a Confucian notion of self-cultivation and the earlier history of proffering models for emulation, suzhi includes physical qualities as well as psychological and cultural qualities, and combines Marxist and neoliberal economics with the desire to, and I quote, modernize, develop, and improve people. Thus, this self-help literature and the improvement it promises can be seen as a symptom of the larger suzhi discourse. As the museum's exhibits and the self-help titles indicate, there is a contemporary Chinese discourse which advocates for learning from Jewish models and their perceived economic and cultural successes, thus developing oneself and one's children. Now, to look at the next museum, the Shanghai Jewish Refuges Museum. This is housed in the former Ohel Moshe Synagogue and located in the former refugee section of World War II Shanghai, which is home to approximately 23,000 Jewish refugees. Built in 1927, the synagogue was confiscated by the government in 1949 and was used first as a psychiatric hospital and later offices. In 2007, it was restored by the local government and turned into the Shanghai Jewish Refuges Museum. Currently, it is part of a Jewish heritage tourist area in Shanghai and has become a popular destination. So the main statue and the main statue we just saw previously and the memorial wall we see here is by the artist Klening. So we have in the statue, we have the girl with her arms outstretched, the birds of freedom, the man reading the book, the menorah. There's an entire like Exodus type feeling to this that I want to kind of, that is considered, is taken throughout the museum, because this museum, like the Harbin Jewish Museum, emphasizes the protection that the city offered the Jewish refugees. This is also enhanced by the memorial wall, which lists over 13,000 names of refugees taken from the book Exile Shanghai, 1930 to 1947, which was a census ordered by the Japanese army. And so this role of name after name, it recalls other commemorative sites, such as the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, etc. So this narrative, the narrative of the museum emphasizes how Shanghai offered a refuge to the Jews. This is stated in the display signage as well as the objects. So here we have a small statue. This is kind of producing the story of a magnanimous protective China. So we have a small statue with a poem titled "Take Me Under Your Wings" by Chaim Nahman Bialik, who is regarded as Israel's national poet, which begins, "Take me under your wings, be my mother and my sister to me. May your lap be a shelter for my head, a nest for my desolate prayers." So, we have again this image of these refugees with children and their bags. We also have things that are not so subtle. We have this menorah as a statue by Ian Leventhal. The label says the menorah has become one of the most enduring symbols of Judaism. Represented here, the menorah twists and writhes with agony and pain inflicted to the Jewish people during the Holocaust period. And yet the light of home and promise of a just future emanate from its light. The dragon, fierce and proud, wraps itself protectively around the menorah base, a reflection of Chinese moral fortitude. So we have this Chinese dragon kind of protecting the menorah. So China protecting the Jewish refugees. Other objects also contain this statue, which is from it's called the girl from a Jewish girl in Shanghai. So this is how the narrative in the museum becomes intertextual as well, because it's like referring to other cultural products. So this animated film was from 2010 and was directed by Wang Genfa and Zhang Zhenhui, and it's based on a graphic novel called Wulin. And it was the first Chinese animated film to feature the Holocaust. So the story centers around two Jewish refugee children, Rina and Makeli, and a local Chinese boy, Agen, who helps them. The children have fled to Shanghai because their parents once lived there. Thus, they can speak Chinese. Rina is famous for her beauty, her long red hair, which people are constantly commenting on, and also her masterful violin playing, which she learned from her mother, who is currently imprisoned in Europe. Once they befriend each other, there are episodes of cultural exchange. So for example, Rina introduces Agen to coffee, and his mother teaches her how to make zongzi, this Chinese dumpling, and they are invited to Chinese parties. The story is told in flashbacks. It begins and ends in the shiny cartoon world of present-day hyper-modern Shanghai, but most of it is set in Shanghai and Europe during the Second World War. Parallels are made between the suffering Jews and the suffering Chinese, and their resistance to the Nazis and the Japanese soldiers. For example, Agen's uncle is a Chinese soldier fighting the Japanese who is trying to get medicine to the new Fourth Army. There's a segment with Colonel Messinger, the German Nazi who tried to convince the Japanese to exterminate the Jewish refugees in Shanghai and who gives the Japanese commander a tapestry woven of Jewish women's hair. And Rina refuses to play the Japanese marching song in a Japanese military concert and instead plays songs her mother composed, which is created by anger and by the Japanese and applauded by the Chinese. So this emphasizes, like the museum's narrative with the object, it emphasizes the mutual suffering of the Jews and the Chinese, and Shanghai is a place that welcomed and befriended the Jews and saved them. So as the producer says, the Hongkou district, which is the area where the Jewish Refugees Museum is, calls it used to be Noah's Ark for Jewish people, and there were many touching stories. We hope that this film can give young people a chance to learn about this period of history through traditional friendship between the Chinese and Jewish people and the city's wide acceptance of different cultures. So this is a specific telling China's story as well. This is a story that wants to be told. We have this Jewish arc of protection. We have this magnanimous and generous China, which repeats the views that are found in the displays. It also has a section on Jewish people that have helped the Chinese. So special section on Jacob Rosenfeld, which is built as a belated commemoration because his story was lost. As it explains, it wasn't publicly uncovered until the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, set up a research history unit in 1986, which discovered his service record. He worked as a surgeon and was being promoted to a general in the Chinese New Fourth Army. It emphasizes that since China saved him from genocide, he wanted to give back. So he joined the medical unit of the New Fourth Army, described as being sacrificial and devoted figure whose clinic was open 24 hours, who went without sleep so he could save more lives on the operating table, who insisted on sleeping on the ground, eating the soldiers' coarser food, And he also taught modern medical techniques to Chinese doctors. And this image of him is of him jumping into the water like everyone else to stop the water when the Great Liuling River embankment broke. So I don't know if you can make it out very clearly, but this is a very common Maoist trope that when a flood is threatening something, all these people will jump into the river to provide a human dam to protect those that are downriver, okay? And so we have this person, this Jewish person made Chinese and kind of joining the people that have protected about. Great. So then these are just an example of some of the signs, the exhibition signs you'll see in the museum. So the first emphasizes the alleged friendly relations between the Jewish refugees and the Chinese locals. It says they lived on friendly terms and they went, and I quote, through thick and thin together. And a statement by a refugee emphasizing the locals' tolerance and referring to them as heroes. The second is emphasizes brotherly love, stating that that the Jewish refugees were warmly received by the Chinese who hosted them, took care of them in Chinese hospitals, etc., and thus fell in love with Chinese culture. This is emphasized by clips throughout the museum of refugees praising the locals for allowing them to take up the Chinese people's living space, and also emphasized in a panel attached to the wall commemorating the refugees. So it's this entire thing about this salvational arc and this idea of brotherhood as well. If you can see here, this is an emotional experience. The Chinese residents and I had tears in our eyes upon parting, sensing a kinship resulting from the Japanese occupation to which we all had been subjected. So this entire story that's being portrayed is a bit problematic because other facts and refugee statements contradict this romantic notion. So although there is evidence that the Chinese government was considering creating a place to resettle 100,000 Jews in Yunnan, this never came into fruition. And they just simply ended up in Shanghai because there was no passport control. They docked and trucks sent from Jewish agencies came to take them and their luggage into the city. This was because after Japanese troops occupied Shanghai and the area around it in 1937, except for the international settlement and French concession, no group controlled the port. So it was a free port. Thus, from 1937 to 39, Shanghai was a place where foreigners could enter without finances, visas, prearranged jobs, etc. So in reality, Shanghai was an accidental arc. There's a big presence of Jewish aid societies, soup kitchens, homes for the elderly, hospitals, schools, etc. These were provided by foreign Jewish organizations and wealthy Jewish families based in Shanghai, Hong Kong. So again, like Harbin, they kind of were self-supporting. So although the museum features about the visas for life, as they were called, and these were, there was a Chinese consul general in Vienna called Dr. Ho Fengshan, and he issued these visas, which saved thousands of lives from the Holocaust. But there is a debate over whether or not this was a government decision to issue these visas, or if it was his personal convictions against the wishes of the Chinese ambassador and Chinese government. So he was kind of personally heroic, not through government policy. Finally, several former Jewish refugees, in Shanghai, they're called Shanghailanders, in Harbin are called Harbinitsi. They've countered this notion of this kind of mutual brotherhood, stating that as children, they didn't attend school or play with the local Chinese. Another said that the only time she or her family interacted with the Chinese was when the Chinese were treated in Jewish hospitals, or when the Jewish families employed them, or at the very end of World War II when they all celebrated in the streets together. It wasn't because of indifference, however, just that they didn't share a common language and had their own struggles to survive. And so this is also emphasized in the fact that the vast majority of Jews departed after the war. So for example, by 1959, only 251 remained. So largely this is an imagined relationship. Although there were some Chinese-Jewish romances and some Jews learned Chinese, the two groups kept to themselves, but in both museums, they're kind of reinvented as being brothers. Thus, the narratives of both museums emphasize the protective role of the Chinese state, thus positioning the nation as people as generous benefactors toward the other, that unlike other foreign groups, such as Japan, the Western maritime powers, did not seek to colonize China, but rather take refuge, thus telling China's stories well through presenting China as a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and an upholder of international development. So the stories and museums are telling China's story as well. That is telling the story of a magnanimous China, reconfiguring the state as protector of Jewish refugees, while ignoring the historical political context that makes this protection accidental, and emphasizing Chinese-Jewish relations that have been romanticized, an imagined relationship that wasn't as intense as the museums portray it to be. So it is tempting to end my presentation here, but there is one other thing that problematizes this reading, the story of the Kaifeng Jews, and how their story is one that is not being told. So just to be briefly, the Kaifeng Jews are basically China's indigenous Jews, you can call them, because the Jewish community was founded over 900 years ago in Kaifeng. Now there have been Jewish traders and Jewish travelers and residents to China since probably around the 700s, I believe. But the Kaifeng Jewish community was actually founded in 1100 and has been there continuously to this day. Originally was composed of 17 clans and 500 households, which is estimated to be approximately 3,500 people. They built a synagogue in 1163. It was destroyed by flooding, but then again rebuilt in 1663. It was destroyed by the floods of 1849 and dismantled and sold between 1851 and 1866, all right? So the last rabbi died in 1810. So for the past 200 years, you can say they haven't really had a synagogue or they've had a religious leader. But currently, approximately, there are about 1,000 descendants. However, they still continue to identify as Jews. So we have this Jewish identification. So they've always been connected to world Jewry through various organizations since the late 19th century. So there hasn't been a period, I think more than 20 or 30 years, where there hasn't been a connection with the Jewish community in Kaifeng with other Jewish communities. There's also a very strong cultural memory of being Jewish. This is also reported, they self-report as Jews in the censuses in 1924 and 1952, so they have kind of an identity of being Jewish. In 1952, they also sent Jewish delegates to the National Day and were received by the CCP leadership. However, in 1955, that they were no longer considered a nationality, but had been assimilated, so that they had become Chinese, right? So because they'd been there for so many centuries, they'd actually become Chinese. And the government felt that minorities needed to have a shared economy, language, geography, religion, and culture. So they felt they didn't have enough minority elements in order to be qualified as an official Chinese minority. However, there's still the strong identity of being Jewish. So they wrote Jewish on local ID cards into the 1990s. This also in the 1990s, there's a revival of Judaism in Kaifeng with regular worship services, workshops, Jewish groups, plans for a research institute, a museum, etc. They've been sending representatives to Beijing to meet with the Israeli embassy, and to date, over 24 Kaifeng Jews have emigrated to Israel. However, this is kind of a very interesting story, but it's being obscured, and that's why I kind of titled my presentation An Obscurement. So in 2015, there was a U-turn and the local government closed the school, museum, and prohibited community gatherings. The Kaifeng Museum has some relics, such as stelae that records the Kaifeng Jewish history, but special permission is needed to view the collection. So Judaism isn't recognized as a religion in China, and the Kaifeng Jews are not a recognized minority. And so there's been a lot of thoughts as to why this crackdown happened. And I'll just cover a few brief points that are kind of developed further by scholars that specialize in this. And this is, again, through the Sino-Judaic Institute. Scholars such as Jordan Paper and some later. These are all available in Points East. So Jordan Paper was saying that perhaps the crackdown was due to a history in China of religious institutions undermining Chinese sovereignty, such as the Taiping Rebellion, etc. There's also been some rules that were made, like September 7th, 2017, new rule to regulate religion in order to bolster national security, fight extremism, and restrict faith practiced outside organizations approved by the state. In 2018, a law was passed stating foreign forces have used religion to infiltrate China, and extremism and illegal religious activity are spreading, which have threatened national security and social stability. There's also some other thoughts that are discussed in Points East, which is the newsletter or the journal of the Sino-Judaic Institute. And they they hypothesize that perhaps the Israeli government doesn't want to be inundated with requests for Aliyah, perhaps recognizing the Kaifeng Jews would weaken Sino-Israeli diplomatic relations, perhaps even add fire to the debate of who is a Jew that is always going on in Israel, perhaps because maybe emigrating Kaifeng Jews are seen as unpatriotic, etc. So obviously, there is no museum available that I can add to my analysis in Kaifeng. So the problem I face is, how does one study a museum that isn't there or that is accessible currently? So when I visited Kaifeng in 2019, I met with a member of the community who took me to the remaining sites. One of the most important sites for them was the well, the only remaining piece of the synagogue. So after the synagogue's destruction, the site had been a factory and then a hospital. It was called the People's No. 4 Hospital, and the well was located in the hospital's boiler room. The well had been listed as, and I quote, a unit of special protection by the Kaifeng Cultural Relics Bureau. In 2018, the Bureau dug out the memorial bearing the words Unit of Cultural Relics Protection and sealed the well. Later in 2019, they removed the sign saying that it was the site of the synagogue, as well as other signs in the area. So the bottom image of the hole, that is the well. And this image was given to me by a member of the community that I met in 2019. The upper image is the site of the synagogue. So you can see now it's just a place to park one's car, and there's a bit of garbage hanging around and whatnot. And so what was really struck me about this is that there's no memorial here. Like, as I mentioned before, all the memorials were removed, but it was still very, very important to the Kaifeng Jews that I was meeting. That was one of the questions: have you seen the synagogue? Have you been to the site? This was still a very special site for them. And so currently I'm working my way through the analysis of this site and trying to connect it to my other analysis of the discourse in the other museums. So at this point, I kind of see the well as a metaphor for Kaifeng Jewishness. So this is an absence that is conceptually very present in the minds of those I've spoken with. And so it kind of queries how to remember an absence. Pierre Nora argues that memorials replace community memory with the memorial's materiality, writing, "The less memory is experienced from the inside, the more it exists only through its exterior scaffolding and outward signs." So although the sign has been hidden, and the well made inaccessible, the memory work being done is by the Kaifeng Jews themselves. And considering how tenaciously they've held on to their identity the past 900 years, this memory will probably endure. So to conclude, to return to telling China's stories well, this is a great story to tell, but why isn't it being told? In the other museums, in the story being told, China is positioned as a savior to the foreign European Jews, and thus it connects to the larger state-mandated narrative of China as a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and an upholder of international development. The Kaifeng Jewish story doesn't really connect to these. However, their story does connect to another story, that of acceptance, thus connecting to current global movements towards multiculturalism, as well as perseverance, this continuous identity as Jews, narratives which connect to larger international shifts. These stories could be told and could be received, and this is where this presentation ends and my next research project begins. So thank you very much. I just want to stress these as a very selected bibliography. A wonderful resource is Anson, Leitner, and Jordan paper, the Chinese Jews of Kaifeng. There's also the Sino-Judaic Institute point sheets, and there's the evidence that I was in Kaifeng. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Corey. That was absolutely fascinating, and I've learned so much. I'd like to open the floor now to people who can type the questions they wish to ask Corey. Certainly, I have a few myself, so maybe I'll sort of begin the discussion. I was really interested in the different narratives of the museum. So it seems like the Shanghai Museum and the Harbin Museum both fit within Discourses of the Chinese State, but in quite a different way. I was also kind of interested in the actual historical founding of the museum. You mentioned that Harbin was founded in 2004, that it became museum in 2004. So that's quite a long time after the community itself. Do you know anything about the reason why the museum was created around then? And what kind of developments in history and attitudes towards Judaism in China that sort of coincided with?
Yeah, good question. 2004. In my research, it kind of pointed out that 2004 is actually the time when telling China stories well was actually starting to be told about, right? So there is this huge kind of discursive shift when all of a sudden stories like this can be told about. There's also this warming up of Israeli Chinese relations at the time as well. Like historically, I believe Israel, I could be wrong, but Israel was one of the first countries to recognize that China when it became, the People's Republic of China in 1949, right?
Yeah, but, yes, that's correct.
Yeah, for decades, China had a bit of a cooler attitude towards Israel because they were trying to align themselves with the Arab states that were very anti-Israeli, right? And so around the 2000s is a time when the relations began warming as well. There's also, during that time, there was Harbin wanted to get more investment, and they were actually looking to Israel. And I forget, my mind is blanking, but all these kind of the stars aligned at this one time because was it the former Israeli, oh gosh.
Yeah, there is a plaque in the Harbin graveyard, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, his grandfather was from Harbin. Yeah, so he visited his father's, and so there's all these things that aligned. So we have this kind of discursive shift in the state saying, yeah, we want to be friends with Israel. We also have this kind of thing about telling these Chinese stories. We also have these this investment, this warming of diplomatic relations, all these kind of things kind of work together. There was also a couple people that were behind the scenes working this. I think Avram Ehrlich was one of them, was really trying to promote this and whatnot. So yeah.
This actually brings me into my next question quite nicely, actually. Which was, is within the actual museums themselves, is there any reference to modern Israel? Is there any sort of reference to Chinese-Israel relations, any sort of explicit reference at all?
In the Harbin Museum, I actually had to cut it for this presentation. I should have included it. There's actually an exhibit from the museum, I forget the name of it, is the Museum of the Jewish People in Jerusalem. I think it has had several different shifts in its term of how it's titled now. In fact, I think it's just rebuilt itself. There's a new museum, it's a new renovated museum and whatnot. And they had an exhibit about famous Jews. And this, when you're reading the text, they're all kind of equated with being famous Israelis, even though some of them, were not Israeli, but they were famous Jews, right? I believe there's also some shots of Israeli ambassadors visiting Harbin, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I was also quite interested in some of the kind of close-up visual analysis you had of the Shanghai Museum, and you compared it at one point to Nanjing and to the museum in Nanjing. Is this sort of narrative of mutual suffering evident in a kind of visual iconography? Is there similarity between the museums themselves? Because you seem to imply that at one point.
It's interesting because in my research, originally my research was focused on like sites of trauma in the Chinese context. And so the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, they really kind of, it's based on Yad Vashem, actually. They really—
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're really interested in how it's the Holocaust is being commemorated, memorialized. Oh.
You did?
Oh, maybe not. Okay, yeah, so they're very interested in how it's being memorialized. A lot of the Chinese literature refers to it as the Chinese Holocaust. So discursively and symbolically, it is kind of entwined and compared. There's been a lot of work done on analyzing that specific discourse about comparing the two massacres and whatnot. And it's a lot of interesting stuff about that. Yeah, it's an entire can of worms, and a lot of really cool stuff has been researched into that.
Sure. We actually have a question that's just been typed in, which is, what is your opinion of Pearl Buck's book, Peony, which is about Jews in China in the distant past and seems to believe that everyone was assimilated? Have you heard of this book?
I've heard of the book. And in fact, I used to really like reading Pearl Buck, but I've never actually read Peony. So that's a really good question. I think that's really, I think the entire debate about Jewishness, especially Kaifeng Jewishness, like my poor little presentation has not done it justice. It's like a massive debate, right? But I think it's really quite fascinating because although there's a lot of wrangling about, who is a Jew, who isn't a Jew, we have, say, the law of return stipulating that any Jew can come to Israel. We have the shift in the law of return in 1970 that said anybody who's a Jew or whose grandparent was a Jew or whose spouse is a Jew or who's the spouse of a child of a Jew can come to Israel, right? So, and there's all this debate in Israel about who is a proper Jew, who's a Jew through halacha and all this kind of debate and whatnot. But it's fascinating. I've been reading a lot of interesting work by, I'll just get some names because my like Irene Eber is talking about this, the Chinese Jewish identity. And she proposes that even though they were Sinicized, so they became Chinese, that actually protected their identity, right? Again, Jordan Paper and Anson Leitner talks about that as well. Alex Bender, Matthew Eckstein, and they all say that these people have continued this idea of we are Jewish, right? Regardless, it has never been interrupted in the past 900 years, which is really quite phenomenal.
I found that really fascinating, actually, in the end of your presentation. I had no idea that that identity was still so strong among such a significant number of the sort of ancestors of the Kaifeng Jews today. They're sort of spoken about, but I didn't realize this was very much still within cultural memory. I'd really like to know more about how you got in contact with this community and how you got them to show you around, because it seems like they're not perhaps people who are in favor with the Chinese state right now, perhaps. So how did you go about sort of accessing and making contact with and meeting with this community?
Yeah, I guess I have to stress that this wasn't a formal research project. This was all completely through accident, okay? So I want to stress that now. This is something that I've been writing about in reflection. This is not something I did as a formal research project under the university I'm with now or the university I was previously, all right? Mainly due to this, the situation. It's basically connections via connections. And a lot of my insights are basically from researching what others have read, or I've never interviewed the people. I'm in contact with them and I've met them several times. But I don't want to I'm at this stage where I have to think about whether I want to turn this into a research project or I want to continue them as friends. I don't want to do you know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah. So it's basically connections via connections via connections, and then finding people and then just kind of asking, just having conversations with them and kind of getting that information.
Are they, this is becoming quite sort of ethnographic now, I think, question-wise, but are they very open to discussing their cultural identity with you and discussing this past and this history? I mean, from the photographs, it seemed like they're taking you to a car park, in essence. So, I mean, how do they feel about that? How do they feel about you approaching them, and are they very open?
They're very open. Like they're very eager to connect, and they're also very proud of their Jewishness, right? And they're really interested in kind of connecting with that further. So I think a lot of it has to do, which I didn't really kind of get into, but because they became Sinicized, they became Chinese, they kind of adopted these certain areas of looking to your ancestors, especially your patrilineal ancestors, as being something to always remember. So one thing that I always find incredible about China is you can talk to pretty much anybody and they will tell you where their laojia, their old home is. They don't mean their old home, they mean their grandfather's grandfather old home. So there's a different Chinese concept of history that I think coming from the West, like I really don't have. Like in that sense, like I could not tell you the name of my great grandfather and where he was born. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I understand. Is there an awareness amongst the Kaifeng Jews and their descendants? Is there awareness of the significance of philo-Semitism in China right now? Of, for instance, the books that you were talking about, and of the museums, and of the significance of this ideology or this discourse rather, perhaps to the Chinese state? Do they connect with that at all? Do they have an awareness of it?
They do, and they're very proud of it. Unfortunately, they've also attracted messianic Chinese Christians. And so part of this messianic Chinese Christian endeavor is to Christianize the Jews, right? So there's this old kind of practice, right? And unfortunately, I had a situation where I was meeting one of the Kaifeng Jews and their friends, and it turns out that their friends were actually these messianic Christians who had knocked on their door and were trying to convert them in a way. Do you know what I mean? So there's this kind of interaction.
Yes.
So yeah, so it's not just all so that they are aware of this kind of discourse about Jewishness, this philo-Semitism, but it's also kind of a bit of a target in the sense that these people are being targeted to be converted. If that's
really interesting, and that's not something I've heard of in China before, actually.
And because like proselytizing is illegal in China, and so when I was kind of seeing this, I'm like, okay, this is what's happening. I'm not going to ask any questions about it. Do you know what I mean? So I kind of stepped a wee bit back about it. But yeah, I think it's interesting to note because originally there was a lot of Christian interest in Jews, especially in Chinese Jews, because there was this belief. One of the reasons was there was this kind of belief that they felt that the original Torah contained a reference to Jesus. And they felt that the rabbis removed that reference in the Middle East, right? But that if they could find original Torah scrolls that predate, whatever year it was, right? The fall of the second, whatever, they would actually find the proof that Jesus was reflected in the Torah scrolls. So it's a very weird thing. And so this is why in the 19th century, there were a lot of like missionaries sent, and they were actually trying, and that's why they bought up a lot of, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but after the synagogue was destroyed, these missionaries bought up a lot of the Torah, anything that remained. And this was this belief that they would find Jesus in these records. And of course, it's not true. It was never found, right? Because I forget the number, but all of these Torah scrolls that the Kaifeng Jews owned are all abroad. I think there's some in Toronto, there's some in London, etc. Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I'm trying to sort of get my head around that. Did any of you said they're aware of the philo-Semitic discourses? Are they aware of any of the museums you studied, like the Harbin community and the Shanghai Refuges? Are they aware of those at all, and do they feel sort of any kind of a connection with that?
When I was meeting with my friends, I wanted to take them to the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. And unfortunately, that was the time when it was closed for renovations, but they were very keen about it, right? And so there is this sense of kind of connected to the larger world Jewry, right? At the same time, they're also very, very proud of being Chinese. I think one of the reasons given of why do the Kaifeng Jews want to connect to other Jews is that they want to have Aliyah and go to Israel and become part of the Israeli economy. But the people that I was meeting, they're very middle class, right? They're very middle class in Kaifeng, and I think it's important because a lot of people think about China as being a poor country, but I think if you're middle class in China, you have a much higher standard of living than you could have ever had in places like Canada, the UK, or Israel. I've been to Israel many times, and it's a beautiful country, but it's extremely expensive, right? If I was a middle-class Kaifeng Jew and I had like my own house, I had nice vacations, I had a car, I had a lot of stuff. If I were to give that up and have like a very tiny little apartment, overpriced apartment outside of Tel Aviv, I'm wondering, do you know what I mean? So the idea that they just want to claim Jewishness so that they can move to Israel, I think is pretty false, especially in 2021, right? So from my feeling, when talking to people, it's actually, they do feel they are Jewish and they want to connect with larger world Jewry.
Sure. Are there a lot of scholars actually working on the current contemporary Kaifeng community? Because working on is wrongly phrased, but studying perhaps this community and their beliefs and traditions. Because I know that in the 1990s, it was a very popular area of study, and then sort of the scholarly attention moved more towards Harbin and to Shanghai communities. So is there a kind of move back, do you think, to study the Kaifeng Jews again, or is kind of they're just you?
No, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people working on this. I think a lot of people aren't currently here, and so for the past couple of years it's been kind of very cooled down, and plus with the legal changes and whatnot, it's not, but there's a lot of movements. Like for a while, again, like Sino-Judaic Institute, they had a school to try to kind of re-teach people Judaism, but in kind of a very, as I understand it, it was a very kind of accepting the different forms of Judaism, so the different minhag, the different customs. So but then there's this group called Shavai Israel, which is about kind of bringing some of these, converting them to Orthodox / Ashkenazi / normative Judaism, right?
Sure.
And so there's this kind of tension between trying to take these people and make them normative Jews, or to actually kind of try to resurrect the Chinese Jewishness, right? Because I think often we think of Jews as being Jews. We don't realize that, you know, this certain cultural power that comes, and what Jewishness has become a normative Jewishness.
We actually we have sort of two questions that have kind of come in on that topic. Actually, one asking, has there been any DNA testing on the Kaifeng Jews themselves? You're nodding.
I read one report, this woman saying that she had been DNA tested, and she did have a marker that indicated that she was from where was Iraqi Jewish DNA marker. This is just a report I read, so I didn't get into fuller details. This is what she said. I know that I have a friend of mine who is a Muslim Jew, and he actually had his DNA. Oh, sorry, Muslim Chinese, right? And he had his DNA tested, and he showed me his marker, and it actually shows that his DNA came from the Middle East, because a lot of again, Muslim traders were coming from the Middle East, and they acculturated, etc., etc. Yeah.
Sure. There are some questions in the Q&A here. I'm just sort of picking out the ones that are kind of the most relevant to what we're talking about right now. Somebody's actually asked, are there Jewish businesses currently in certain locations in China? Just a curious question. Do you know of any businesses that are specifically and distinctly Jewish within China?
I know that one of the world's largest producer of kosher food is China. A lot of the kosher food industry comes from China. That's why there's an entire army of kosher supervising rabbis that go around China checking the food factories. Yeah, it's very interesting, because most of this food is for export, but there's also a huge demand in China, because probably about 15-20 years ago, there was a big issue with food safety in China. So a lot of middle-class Chinese people feel that buying kosher food ensures that it is proper food, like it hasn't been adulterated, it hasn't been poisoned, because there was like this poisoned milk scandal. There's a lot of scandals that happened, right? And so yeah, that's
very interesting. Is that just around kosher, or does it also stretch to halal? Because I know there's a lot of halal food here as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that China has a huge Muslim population, right? And so but I'm not too sure. That's a really good question. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any more kind of direct questions that we have sort of coming in now, and I think we're about at the end of the hour. So I want to say thank you very much, Corey. That was a fascinating presentation, and it was so contemporary and so relevant, I feel, right now. So I feel like I've learned a huge amount about China and about Judaism in contemporary China right now. And thank you very much for the ethnographic research specifically, and thank you also for the visual analysis of the museums. I think both of those were pretty fantastic, and we're getting a number of people writing compliments as well, saying it was really good. So thank you very much, Corey. And with that, we'll say good night here in China, and I think good morning to everyone in North America. And there'll be another presentation in this series, same time in 2 weeks. So thank you very much.
Great.
And goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.